Ruthann Veal was born in the quiet corners of Iowa, but the calm surroundings could not mask the turbulence of her early life. From the very beginning, her world was marked by emotional instability, neglect, and a profound lack of support. She did not grow up in a nurturing environment. Instead, she was surrounded by dysfunction that left deep marks on her emotional and psychological makeup. Her mother, often overwhelmed and emotionally unavailable, struggled to maintain a household that was already fraying at the edges. Ruthann's father was absent, physically and emotionally, a void in her life that was never filled. The silence inside the home wasn't peaceful, it was empty, devoid of laughter, comfort, or even basic affection. Ruthann's cries for attention, for validation, were met with indifference. There were no bedtime stories, no warm hugs after a bad day, only cold rooms and long, unspoken nights. As Ruthann entered her early school years, the signs of her emotional distress became increasingly visible to those around her. She often sat alone in the classroom, not out of shyness, but because she didn't know how to connect with other children. She didn't laugh at the jokes others found funny, and she didn't play during recess. Teachers noticed a child who avoided eye contact, fidgeted in her seat, and sometimes erupted into sudden, unprovoked anger. Her academic performance was poor, not because she lacked intelligence, but because there was no one at home to help her understand homework, prepare for school, or praise her for trying. There were no refrigerator drawings or gold stars celebrated at the dinner table, only isolation. The educators around her treated her behavior as a disciplinary issue rather than a symptom of deeper pain. She was sent to detention more times than she was offered counseling. Each punishment added another brick to the wall Ruthann was building around herself. By the time she was in 4th grade, her identity within the school system had been reduced to a single word: troublemaker. The Iowa Department of Human Services began to take notice when Ruthann was just 8 years old. Reports of neglect, unsupervised behavior, and volatile domestic incidents triggered multiple investigations. She was removed from her home several times and placed in temporary foster care, but these placements brought their own traumas. Some foster families were indifferent, treating her as just another responsibility in a long line of state-assigned children. Others were far worse, implementing cruel punishments and offering no affection. One home believed in harsh discipline, using verbal humiliation and physical control as daily tools of order. Instead of healing, Ruthann collected new emotional scars, layered over the old ones. Every time she moved to a new house, she left behind any fragile sense of belonging she had managed to build. Each transition meant a new school, new rules, and new authority figures, none of whom understood the child behind the behavior. By the time she turned 12, Ruthann had cycled through multiple group homes and temporary placements. Her case file grew thicker, but no real solution was ever found. With each move, she became more emotionally detached and more resistant to authority. She grew tired of the cycle, of adults pretending to care only to disappear after a few months. She became confrontational, sometimes physically aggressive, and often ran away from the home she was placed in. Her actions were cries for help, but they were interpreted as threats. At one group home, she spent days refusing to speak, only to erupt in a violent rage when a staff member tried to force her into a scheduled therapy session. These outbursts earned her labels: defiant, oppositional, unstable. She was prescribed medications, sent for evaluations, and passed from one facility to the next. No one stopped to ask what she needed. They only asked what she had done wrong. Therapy, when it was offered, was inconsistent. One therapist noted signs of early trauma, abandonment, and deep-seated trust issues. Another recommended residential treatment, citing oppositional defiance disorder and emerging antisocial behavior. These evaluations were clinical, detached from the human suffering at the center. Ruthann was more than a diagnosis. She was a child who had never known consistency, love, or safety. But the system didn't see her that way. It saw her as a risk to manage. Her behaviors were monitored, not understood. Her potential was overlooked in favor of managing her volatility. And every time she resisted or lashed out, the system responded with more control, restraints, isolation, and further removal from anything that resembled a normal life. At 14, Ruthann was living in a juvenile group facility designed for girls with behavioral problems. It was a cold, institutional place where the days were structured around rules, consequences, and supervision. The staff were often undertrained and overwhelmed. They focused more on compliance than care. Ruthann, now used to this routine, had learned how to manipulate the system to some extent. When to speak, when to stay silent, when to fight, and when to withdraw. But the cracks were becoming more visible. She would go silent for days, retreating into herself, then suddenly explode in a fit of rage over something as small as a denied privilege. The other girls avoided her. The staff feared her. The records described her as emotionally unstable and a danger to others. Yet beneath all of it, she remained a child, a teenager whose life had been defined by instability and pain. The moments of hope were brief and often crushed by reality. One social worker tried to build a connection, taking Ruthann on supervised outings and encouraging her to talk. For a short time, Ruthann seemed to respond. She smiled more, talked about wanting to live with a real family. But the effort was short-lived. The social worker was transferred to another case, and Ruthann was left alone again. It was a familiar story. Every time she began to trust, the system reminded her that trust was dangerous. People left. Promises were broken. She learned not to expect anything from anyone. By now, Ruthann had developed a hardened exterior. She no longer cried. She no longer asked questions. She existed in survival mode, operating in a world that had never offered her security. The system, rather than rehabilitating her, had become part of the problem. Its cold bureaucracy failed to account for the emotional complexity of a girl who had known nothing but abandonment. And so, as she entered mid-adolescence, Ruthann Veal was already on a collision course with tragedy. Not because she was destined to fail, but because no one ever showed her how to succeed. In truth, Ruthann Veal was not born violent. She was shaped by her environment. She was a product of every adult who failed to protect her, every institution that failed to intervene meaningfully, and every system that viewed her as a case number instead of a human being. What she needed was consistency, compassion, and someone willing to walk with her through the chaos. What she received was judgment, rejection, and containment. Her fragile childhood, rooted in emotional neglect and systemic failure, planted the seeds of a storm that would later shake the state of Iowa. And when that storm arrived, it could no longer be ignored, not by the public, not by the media, and certainly not by those who had once turned away. By the time Ruthann Veal turned 11, she had already become a name known to local law enforcement, group home staff, and juvenile officers across Iowa. But it wasn't for anything malicious, at least not yet. It was for vanishing. Repeatedly. Running away became her language of protest, a desperate form of communication in a world that never really listened. She wasn't rebelling for thrill or rebellion's sake. She was trying to escape environments that felt cold, unsafe, or simply indifferent. Each disappearance wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. A child running from structures meant to protect her, yet consistently failing to understand her. The state would find her, sometimes after days, sometimes weeks. Dirty, hungry, emotionally closed off. Each time she was returned either to a foster home or shelter, the cycle repeated. The staff would note her detachment. Caseworkers would log her behavior. And then, when she ran again, those same notes were copied, adjusted slightly, and placed in updated files. No one ever sat down to ask her why she ran, not in a way that mattered. Not in a way that got through to her. The juvenile system at the time was ill-equipped for children like Ruthann. Overwhelmed and underfunded, it operated like a conveyor belt. Intake, temporary placement, documentation, and eventual discharge. Therapy was a checkbox, not a solution. The placements she entered weren't homes. They were buildings with staff working rotating shifts, where affection was measured in observation notes and meals were handed out like rations. Every bed had a child with a story, and in those overcrowded rooms Ruthann's pain became background noise. Her behavior, once categorized as defiant, now shifted into something more complex. She became emotionally volatile. Sometimes she lashed out, other times she shut down completely. Staff began referring to her as difficult to manage, or emotionally unpredictable. One report described her as a child on the edge of institutionalization, but not criminal enough to qualify. She was falling through a gap the system never intended to address. Children who weren't violent, yet were too emotionally damaged for traditional placements. By 12, Ruthann had become less trusting, more aggressive. Her survival instincts began to evolve into something more primal. If the system wouldn't protect her, she would protect herself. She stopped talking to caseworkers. She refused counseling. She learned how to manipulate just enough to get what she needed: food, a temporary stay, sometimes a ride. Then she'd disappear again. The girl who once cried during intake interviews now stared blankly during assessments. She was learning to shut the world out, one painful lesson at a time. The streets of small-town Iowa aren't built for children to survive on, but Ruthann adapted. She learned where to sleep without being seen. She figured out which convenience stores wouldn't call the cops if she stole snacks. She recognized which alleys were safe during the night and which weren't. Older kids showed her how to stay invisible. Runaways become their own kind of society, linked not by friendship but by necessity. Trust was rare. And for Ruthann it was non-existent. During one winter in Cedar Rapids, she disappeared for nearly 3 weeks. It was bitter cold. Outreach teams feared the worst. When police finally located her, she was holed up in a condemned house with no electricity, wrapped in stolen blankets, eating from dumpsters. She hadn't asked for help. She hadn't expected any to come. That incident, more than any other, reflected what she had become. A child in survival mode, trained by abandonment, forged by neglect. Court documents from that period paint a picture of bureaucratic helplessness. Judges expressed frustration at the lack of long-term options. Social workers noted her increasing detachment. One case file included a chilling line: "Ruthann is slipping through every safety net available." It wasn't an exaggeration. She wasn't being raised, she was being processed. Group homes began rejecting her intake. Some cited her history of running away. Others mentioned her refusal to engage with counseling or follow rules. She was placed in more restrictive facilities, still technically not correctional institutions but only just. One such facility was known for housing youth on the edge of delinquency. Ruthann didn't fit the profile, but there was no place else to send her. She didn't belong anywhere and everyone knew it. Her interactions with adults became increasingly transactional. She learned what to say to get through evaluations. She told people what they wanted to hear, not because she believed it but because it sped up the process. She would promise to stay put. She would claim to feel better. And when their guard was down, she'd run again. The cycle was never broken. It simply kept looping, each time tightening its grip. Emotionally, she began to resemble less of a child and more of a storm. Angry, guarded, and empty-eyed. Her school records were scattered and incomplete. Most noted her as non-compliant or disengaged. She was in and out of classrooms so quickly that teachers rarely remembered her name. Learning had long stopped being a priority. Education was replaced with instinct: how to lie, how to steal, how to disappear. Some staff who worked with her during those years would later recall moments when they glimpsed the child beneath the armor. A brief smile. A hesitant question. But those moments were fleeting. The system hadn't broken her with cruelty. It had done so with apathy. And apathy, Ruthann had learned, was harder to survive than anything else. By the time she turned 13, she had no stable address, no consistent adult in her life, and no sense of safety. Her foster files labeled her a chronic runaway. Police blotters listed her name among habitual disappearances. The shelters had grown tired. The courts had run out of ideas. And Ruthann, just a teenage girl, had come to believe that escape was the only thing she could control. Her story was no longer about saving her. It had become about managing her. The hope that she would find her way back to normalcy had long faded. Now, the conversations were about how long before something went truly wrong. Not if, but when. By the summer of 1993, Ruthann Veal was only 14, yet her life had already spiraled through a series of failed placements, ignored warnings, and institutional blind spots. Her name was well known to juvenile authorities in Iowa, but not because of any serious crime, at least not yet. She was mostly remembered as a runaway, a troubled child with no real direction, endlessly bouncing from one temporary solution to another. Nothing stuck. No placement worked. No therapy lasted. The system didn't know what to do with her, and that uncertainty left her roaming the streets of Waterloo alone. She had run again, slipping away from her most recent group home just days before. This time she wasn't reported missing right away. Staff believed she might return on her own, as she often had. But Ruthann had no intention of returning. Her mind had shifted. She was angry, isolated, and determined to take matters into her own hands, though what that meant, even she didn't fully understand. Hunger, exhaustion, and emotional collapse were brewing inside her like a storm. Somewhere during those drifting hours, Ruthann came into possession of a knife. No official report confirms where or how she got it. Perhaps it was shoplifted, perhaps stolen from a shelter kitchen, or maybe it was handed to her by someone who had no idea what she was capable of. Whatever the origin, the knife changed the dynamic of everything that followed. It became not just a tool but a symbol, of control, of threat, of power she'd never felt before. On the afternoon of June 3rd, Ruthann approached a quiet, modest house in a residential neighborhood. It belonged to 66-year-old Catherine Haynes, a retired librarian living alone. There was no evidence that Ruthann and Haynes had ever met. No family connections, no shared acquaintances. This wasn't about revenge, nor was it a burglary gone wrong in the usual sense. It was something darker, more fractured. Ruthann knocked. Catherine answered. And for reasons that would never be fully explained, she invited the girl inside. What happened next wasn't a moment of panic. It wasn't an impulsive act that spiraled out of control. The crime scene told a very different story. Once inside, Ruthann pulled the knife and attacked with brutal precision. Catherine Haynes was stabbed repeatedly, over a dozen times. Some of the wounds were defensive, suggesting she had tried to fight back. Others were targeted and severe, aimed at vital areas of the body. The struggle left blood across the living room. There were signs that Catherine had tried to crawl away, to escape or reach a phone. But she never made it. Ruthann didn't linger. She didn't panic or fumble in fear. She went through the house, found Catherine's purse and took her credit cards. She left the scene in silence, walking away from a house that had just become a crime scene, a home turned into a place of horror. The brutality of the murder shocked even seasoned investigators. It didn't fit the typical profile of a young runaway. Waterloo police were used to juvenile delinquents, vandalism, petty theft, maybe a stolen car. But this? A calculated, personal attack on a complete stranger? It was baffling. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed nearby residents and gathered forensic evidence. But without an obvious suspect or motive, leads were initially scarce. Meanwhile, Ruthann used the stolen credit cards to buy food, clothing and other items from local stores. Surveillance footage captured her movements, and the stolen card transactions eventually provided the trail police needed. Within days, the information pointed directly back to Ruthann Veal. She was picked up without incident, offering no resistance. But what startled police the most wasn't her arrest, it was her demeanor. She was calm. Not arrogant, not weeping, not hysterical. Just quiet. Almost numb. During questioning, Ruthann didn't offer a clear motive. She didn't speak of rage or a specific trigger. She gave no explanation for choosing that house, that woman, or that day. She admitted to being inside the house. She admitted to taking the cards. But when asked about the murder itself, she said little. It was as if even she didn't fully grasp what she had done, or if she did, she no longer wanted to revisit it. The community reaction was swift and deeply unsettled. People struggled to reconcile the image of a 14-year-old girl with the horror of what had occurred. The media ran headlines that blurred the line between child and monster. Teen girl charged in murder read one. Runaway or killer? Asked another. For many, the questions weren't just about Ruthann, they were about the system. How had someone so young slipped through so many cracks? Why had no intervention worked? Why had it taken a murder for the world to take her seriously? Catherine Haynes' family was devastated. They gave statements about her kindness, her patience, her love of books and gardening. She was not someone who lived recklessly or invited danger. She had likely opened her door out of instinctive trust, seeing only a lost young girl in need of help. That kindness became the reason for her death. In court, Ruthann's case became a legal and ethical challenge. Should she be tried as an adult or a juvenile? The prosecution argued that the crime was too violent, too deliberate for juvenile court. The defense pushed back, highlighting her age, her traumatic past, and the failures of the system that left her untreated and unprotected. Both sides made compelling arguments, but the court ultimately decided to try her as an adult. This decision sent a message: age would not excuse savagery. Yet others saw it as a failure to address the deeper issue. A broken child turned into a criminal because the system gave her no alternative. In the days after her arrest, the spotlight turned not only on Ruthann but also on the institutions that failed her. Juvenile services, foster care agencies, school counselors, all became part of the public conversation. People debated what could have been done differently. Could a better placement have saved her? Could therapy have redirected her rage? Could someone, anyone, have stopped her descent before it was too late? As Ruthann sat in jail, awaiting trial, her story became less about a single act and more about a system that ignored the warning signs until they exploded into tragedy. She wasn't just a runaway anymore. She was a murderer. But she was also a child who had never been given the tools to become anything else. This chapter marked the moment where everything changed, not just for Ruthann Veal but for the community, the victim's family, and the criminal justice system. It was no longer about missed opportunities or damaged youth. It was about reckoning with a reality no one wanted to face. A lost girl had picked up a knife, and nothing would ever be the same again. Ruthann Veal's escape was short-lived. In the aftermath of the brutal killing of Catherine Haynes, she left behind a trail that law enforcement didn't take long to follow. She had stolen credit cards from the victim's home and, in what seemed like a mixture of teenage impulsivity and survival instinct, began using them almost immediately. Purchases were made within hours of the murder, first at a convenience store, then at a retail outlet in Waterloo. Surveillance footage, though grainy, captured a young girl matching Ruthann's description. For investigators, it was the first concrete link between the killing and a suspect. For Ruthann, it was the beginning of the end of her illusion of freedom. The Waterloo Police Department received the first tip within 24 hours. A cashier had reported an oddly quiet teenage girl using a credit card and signing with a name that didn't match. When officers tracked the origin of the card and connected it to Catherine Haynes, whose body had just been discovered, the case quickly shifted from routine fraud to homicide. The brutality of the crime and the senselessness of it left the public stunned. News headlines were already swirling with fear and disbelief by the time Ruthann was located. She was found alone at a public park, sitting on a bench in the late afternoon sun, with a plastic bag of snacks and a change of clothes beside her. There was no dramatic chase. No confrontation. When officers approached, she didn't run. Instead, she stood, looked at them, and simply said, "I figured you were coming." That moment would later become a focal point in media coverage, not just because of the eerie calmness with which she accepted arrest, but because it contradicted the public's expectation of what a 14-year-old suspect might look or sound like. Ruthann Veal wasn't crying or pleading. She wasn't confused or scared. She was composed. During her interrogation, Ruthann displayed what investigators described as an emotional flatness. She spoke about Catherine Haynes in the past tense, detailing how she entered the home, what she did, and what she took. She did not apologize. She did not cry. When asked why she chose that particular house or victim, she shrugged and said, "It was open." The answer chilled everyone in the room. Detectives pressed for a motive, robbery, anger, revenge, but nothing coherent emerged. There was no narrative she clung to. It was as if the killing didn't demand explanation. In her mind, it just was. The knife was recovered from a nearby storm drain, exactly where Ruthann said she had thrown it. Blood evidence from the blade and the crime scene matched the DNA samples taken from her clothes. There was no ambiguity. Forensically, the case was airtight. But what troubled everyone, from the police to the district attorney, wasn't the question of who did it. It was why. What could drive a 14-year-old girl, barely out of childhood, to commit such a cold, calculated act of violence? As word of her arrest spread, the community's grief turned into confusion and rage. Catherine Haynes had lived a quiet life. A retired worker in her late 60s, she was known in her neighborhood as polite, soft-spoken, and generous. There was no indication that she had any connection to Ruthann. Her door had been open, possibly out of kindness. And that kindness was met with death. The media coverage that followed was intense. Local and national outlets picked up the story with headlines that blurred between shock and sensationalism. Killer child of Iowa, 14-year-old slasher, murder in a quiet home. It was not just the violence of the act but the age of the accused that gripped public attention. Commentators debated whether Ruthann should be tried as an adult. Child psychologists weighed in. Politicians used the case to push for tougher juvenile sentencing laws. Meanwhile, Ruthann remained in detention, largely silent and detached. In early interviews, public defenders noted that she was cooperative but unengaged. She answered questions, acknowledged facts, and rarely volunteered anything beyond what was necessary. When asked about Catherine Haynes' family, she reportedly said, "I don't know them." It wasn't coldness in the traditional sense, it was as if the emotional component of the crime had never registered for her at all. Legal proceedings began quickly. Because of the severity of the crime and the apparent premeditation, prosecutors argued to transfer Ruthann's case to adult court. It sparked a heated debate throughout Iowa. Could someone so young truly understand the consequences of her actions? And if she did that understanding justify punishing her as an adult? Experts testified on both sides. Some described Ruthann as deeply traumatized by years in the foster care system, a child abandoned and hardened by neglect. Others argued that trauma, while tragic, did not excuse murder. Psychological evaluations painted a complicated picture. Ruthann was not psychotic, but she exhibited severe emotional detachment, signs of antisocial behavior, and a flat affect that made it difficult to discern remorse or guilt. Her IQ was average. Her language skills were intact. Yet she seemed fundamentally disconnected from the moral gravity of what she had done. Public perception of Ruthann shifted rapidly. Early sympathy for a troubled foster child gave way to outrage as more details emerged. Court documents described more than 30 stab wounds on Catherine Haynes. The crime scene photos, sealed from public view but described by investigators, were disturbing. Ruthann's behavior post-crime, using credit cards, wandering the streets, making no real effort to hide, was interpreted not as childish ignorance, but as calculated indifference. Still, not everyone viewed her as a monster. Child welfare advocates pointed to systemic failures. Ruthann had been flagged by schools, social workers, and juvenile officers for years. She had been in and out of more than a dozen placements. Therapists had raised alarms about her increasing aggression and lack of emotional stability. But resources were stretched thin, and no agency had ever taken long-term responsibility for her care. Some argued that Ruthann Veal was not a cautionary tale about crime, but about the consequences of neglect. These debates extended into courtroom strategy. The defense emphasized her background, how the system had failed her, how her upbringing left her ill-equipped to handle conflict, emotion, or relationships. The prosecution focused on the victim, on the brutality of the act, and on public safety. Was Ruthann Veal salvageable? Or was she simply too far gone? Through it all, Ruthann rarely spoke. In one notable courtroom appearance, she looked directly at the victim's daughter, who had come to testify about the impact of her mother's death. Ruthann did not cry. She did not look away. Afterward, the daughter said, "I didn't see a child in that chair. I saw someone who had taken everything from us and didn't even blink." In the end, Ruthann's own mistakes, using stolen cards, not running far, not hiding the weapon, had unraveled the mystery of Catherine Haynes' death. But what it revealed was far more unsettling. This wasn't a crime committed in passion or panic. It had elements of deliberation, of planning, of purpose, even if that purpose remained obscured. Ruthann Veal was no longer the invisible girl in the child welfare system. She was now a symbol of brokenness, of violence, of the thin line between childhood and criminality. And as her trial loomed, one question remained unanswered. Was there still a human being behind those distant eyes, or had the system that failed to save her also created the person who no longer seemed to care? The arrest of Ruthann Veal sent shockwaves through the community of Waterloo, Iowa. The revelation that a 14-year-old girl had brutally murdered a 66-year-old woman shattered any illusion that age was an automatic barrier to violence. But what followed her arrest was equally controversial. Almost immediately, the state announced it would charge Ruthann Veal as an adult, a decision that ignited a firestorm of debate about justice, age, and accountability. In the weeks after her arrest, Ruthann was transferred from juvenile detention to the adult criminal justice system. The move wasn't common, but in this case, prosecutors insisted it was necessary. They cited the brutality of the murder, her lack of remorse, and the calculated nature of the crime. To them, this wasn't an impulsive act of a scared child. It was a premeditated killing committed with precision. Under Iowa law, the gravity of the crime gave the state authority to bypass juvenile court and proceed with adult charges. It was a stark message. Childhood wouldn't protect someone from punishment when the crime was so extreme. The decision to try Ruthann as an adult stirred public reaction. Some applauded it, believing that justice required consequences proportionate to the act. Others recoiled at the idea that a 14-year-old, clearly shaped by trauma and neglect, could be subjected to the full weight of adult sentencing. Editorials debated her humanity and her culpability. Letters to the editor, call-in radio shows, and televised news reports reflected a divided public. Some saw a monster. Others saw a broken child abandoned by the system long before she ever picked up a knife. As the trial date approached, Ruthann's defense team began crafting a strategy focused not on denying the murder but on explaining it. Her attorneys, assigned by the court, dug deep into her background. They uncovered a life marked by chaos, years in foster care, cycles of abuse, psychiatric evaluations left unaddressed, and a trail of warnings ignored by institutions meant to protect her. The defense leaned heavily on psychological evidence, requesting multiple mental health evaluations. These assessments painted a grim picture. Ruthann suffered from clinical depression, showed signs of detachment and emotional blunting, and exhibited early symptoms consistent with personality disorders. She wasn't just troubled, she was damaged in a way few could understand. In court, Ruthann was a contradiction. Small in stature, with the soft features of a teenager, she sat motionless in a courtroom built for hardened adults. The oversized jumpsuit, the shackles, the formal legal proceedings, all seemed surreal when juxtaposed with her age. She rarely spoke, often staring blankly at the walls or at the floor. Journalists noted her quiet demeanor and the eerie absence of visible emotion. The prosecution presented its case methodically. They detailed the events of June 1993, Ruthann's escape from her placement, the acquisition of a knife, the decision to approach Catherine Haynes' home, and the brutal stabbing that followed. Crime scene photographs were shown to the jury. Testimony from forensic experts confirmed that the wounds inflicted were not the result of a frenzied outburst. They were deliberate, consistent, and focused. The stolen credit cards were introduced into evidence, along with footage of Ruthann attempting to use them. It was a tight, clean case and the jury listened intently. But it was the testimonies about Ruthann's demeanor after the murder that struck a chord. Police officers who interrogated her recalled her lack of remorse. She spoke of the murder as if it were just another event in a long string of bad days. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. She didn't seem to grasp or care about what she had done. That absence of emotion became a defining element of the trial. Prosecutors used it to argue that she was not only capable of violence, but also capable of understanding and accepting responsibility for it. The defense tried to steer the jury toward the bigger picture. They emphasized her age, arguing that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control and judgment, was still developing. They spoke about how years of trauma had molded her into someone detached from empathy and social norms. Expert witnesses explained that Ruthann had spent most of her life being ignored, punished, and tossed between institutions. Her actions, they argued, were the result of a child who had never experienced real stability, never received sustained treatment, and never had a chance to understand herself, let alone the consequences of her actions. Yet the jury wasn't swayed. The evidence was overwhelming. The brutality of the crime eclipsed any arguments about developmental psychology. The jurors didn't deny that Ruthann had suffered, but suffering, they reasoned, didn't absolve her of responsibility. They returned with a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The sentencing phase was perhaps the most difficult part for observers. Ruthann sat quietly as the judge prepared to deliver a sentence that would alter the course of her life forever. There was no dramatic outburst, no final plea for leniency. In Iowa, first-degree murder carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge had no discretion. The gavel came down and just like that, Ruthann Veal, 14 years old, emotionally fractured and forever altered, became one of the youngest females in the state's history to be sentenced to die in prison. Outside the courtroom, reactions were swift. Victim advocates praised the ruling, calling it a necessary stance against violent youth crime. Others were horrified. Legal scholars and child welfare advocates questioned the morality of sentencing a child to life without parole. National media picked up the story, and Ruthann's case became part of a larger conversation about juvenile justice in America. The ruling raised urgent questions. At what age is someone fully accountable for their actions? Can a child who kills ever be rehabilitated? Does a harsh sentence for a broken child reflect justice, or institutional failure? These debates didn't stop Ruthann's sentence from going into effect, but they sparked legal reviews and future reforms in states across the country. For Ruthann herself, the trial marked a strange kind of closure. The chaos of the outside world, the foster homes, the institutions, the escapes, was replaced by the rigid structure of prison life. She would no longer run because she had nowhere left to go. But her story wasn't finished. While the legal system considered her case closed, activists, lawyers, and mental health professionals began to cite her name in papers, conferences, and debates. She became a symbol, not of evil but of what happens when a child is abandoned by every adult meant to help her, and what that abandonment can turn into. In the courtroom, the law had spoken. Ruthann Veal had been tried as an adult. But outside the courtroom, the conversation about what justice truly meant for someone like her was only just beginning. Ruthann Veal entered the adult prison system in 1993 as the youngest female inmate in the state of Iowa. At just 14 years old, she was led through the gates of the Mitchellville Correctional Facility, a place built for adult women, many of them hardened by decades of criminal behavior. She stood out, not because of notoriety but because of her size, her voice, and her age. The guards, the inmates, even the administrators weren't prepared for her. She was a teenager in a system never designed for children. From the beginning, prison officials recognized the risk. Ruthann was placed in a segregated unit, isolated for her own protection. She couldn't be housed with the general population, not yet. She had no understanding of the culture inside, no grasp of the power dynamics that ruled inmate life. Early reports describe her as quiet, alert, and compliant, though visibly overwhelmed. Her emotional state was guarded, difficult to assess. A prison psychologist noted that she displayed signs of detachment, neither fear nor defiance, but a blank stare that suggested deep emotional numbing. Her routine was stripped down to the basics. She was woken early, fed on a schedule, and assigned small tasks appropriate for her age and restrictions. Schooling was attempted but inconsistent. While legally entitled to an education, the infrastructure to support her learning inside prison was limited. A tutor visited her cell block a few times a week, providing worksheets and reading materials, but without structured classes or peer interaction, Ruthann fell further behind academically. Over time the efforts tapered off. Other inmates viewed her with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Most had never seen someone that young in the system. Some offered her advice, while others avoided her entirely. Staff were similarly divided. Some felt sympathy for her, others believed she deserved her sentence regardless of age. For Ruthann, it was just another environment she had to adapt to. She didn't cry, didn't lash out, didn't plead for leniency. She simply adjusted. There were moments of trouble. Though she was mostly compliant, Ruthann occasionally broke rules, refusing to attend certain scheduled programs or failing to respond to direct orders. Each incident was documented, though always minor. She wasn't violent. She wasn't disruptive. But she was withdrawn. Over time, her file filled with entries describing her as emotionally distant, nonverbal during counseling, and exhibiting flat affect. Despite efforts to help her adjust, Ruthann received limited psychological care. The prison system offered baseline mental health services, but nothing intensive or long-term. The trauma she carried, the childhood instability, the abuse, the crime itself, was never fully addressed. She met with prison therapists sporadically, usually when her behavior required evaluation. There were no breakthrough sessions, no documented progress in processing her past. She remained emotionally frozen, locked in a state of quiet endurance. Physically, Ruthann matured. Her once small frame filled out, her features sharpened with age, and she began to resemble an adult woman. But emotionally and socially she lagged behind. She had never dated, never attended a school dance, never made real friends. Her adolescence was spent in a concrete cell. Milestones that marked the passage into adulthood, graduations, first jobs, relationships, were entirely absent from her life. Every stage of her development unfolded within the confines of institutional walls. By the time she was 18, she was transferred into the general population. The decision came after assessments confirmed she could safely integrate with other inmates. But even then she remained somewhat isolated. She didn't engage much with the prison community. Inmates described her as polite but uninterested. She avoided drama, refrained from cliques, and kept to herself. She worked when assigned, completed tasks quietly, and returned to her cell without complaint. The prison staff continued to monitor her. Every few years she underwent psychological reevaluation, mostly to update records. The findings never changed significantly. She was emotionally blunted, socially underdeveloped, and deeply introverted. There were no signs of improvement, but also no red flags of escalating instability. She was static, an inmate who had stopped growing emotionally at the age of 14. Occasionally, journalists reached out for interviews, particularly during national conversations about juvenile sentencing. Ruthann always declined. She never sought attention, never requested clemency, and never gave interviews. Her silence only deepened the public mystery surrounding her. For some, she remained a symbol of a system that failed both a child and a victim. For others, she was simply a murderer who got what she deserved. But for the prison staff, Ruthann Veal was just another long-term inmate, quiet, compliant, and unchanging. Visitation records show almost no contact with the outside world. She received very few visitors over the years. Her mother, who had long since lost custody, reportedly never came. No family ties were re-established. Letters trickled in occasionally, curious strangers, activists, or religious groups, but few were answered. Ruthann maintained minimal contact with anyone beyond the prison walls. Her isolation wasn't just physical, it was total. In her late 20s, Ruthann enrolled in a vocational program offered through the facility. She learned basic culinary skills, helping in the prison kitchen. Supervisors noted that she was diligent, attentive, and rarely made mistakes. It was the closest she came to a routine purpose, and for a time it gave her something to focus on. She didn't socialize with the kitchen staff, but she followed orders well and rarely missed a shift. The program ended after a few years, but her participation left a rare positive note in her record. There was no disciplinary history of violence, no threats against staff or fellow inmates. Ruthann aged quietly. She spent time reading, journaling, and working small jobs within the prison. She never requested a transfer, never petitioned for a sentence review, and never expressed bitterness about her circumstances. She was, in many ways, a model inmate, obedient, orderly, and invisible. But those traits came not from rehabilitation but from resignation. The debate outside the prison continued. As the years passed, legal experts, advocates, and politicians revisited the ethics of sentencing children to life without parole. Landmark Supreme Court decisions in the 2010s began to question the constitutionality of such sentences, especially for juveniles. Names of cases like Graham v. Florida and Miller v. Alabama made headlines, leading to reviews of hundreds of sentences nationwide. Some juvenile offenders were re-sentenced, given the chance at parole, or transferred to youth-focused facilities. But Ruthann's case remained untouched. Iowa's legal system was slow to respond, and her conviction had been particularly high-profile. Prosecutors opposed any re-sentencing efforts. The victim's family continued to speak out against clemency. And Ruthann herself never filed an appeal. Her silence was, perhaps, her most consistent choice. Even when laws changed around her, she made no move to benefit from them. By her mid-30s, Ruthann had spent more of her life inside prison than outside. She had no digital footprint, no social media presence, and no public voice. She was an artifact of an era when justice was swift and absolute, when children who committed adult crimes were treated as adults without question. Her existence became a quiet footnote in a larger legal debate, referred to in articles and symposiums, but rarely examined in detail. The walls around her changed over time, staff rotated, rules evolved, new inmates arrived, but Ruthann remained the same. She had become part of the prison's landscape, a fixture in a system that had no plan for what to do with children who became adults behind bars. Rehabilitation was never the goal, containment was. In recent years, the case of Ruthann Veal has resurfaced in academic circles. Professors of law and juvenile justice cite her as an example of systemic failure, an emblem of how the line between child and adult can be erased in the name of punishment. But those discussions remain theoretical. For Ruthann, nothing changes. Her day starts and ends the same way it has for decades, locked in a cell, surrounded by silence, growing older in a place where time only moves forward but lives never truly progress. Her transformation from a runaway teenager to an adult inmate wasn't dramatic. It was slow, bureaucratic, and largely unnoticed. There were no redemptive arcs, no scandalous behavior, no pleas for forgiveness. Ruthann simply became what the system shaped her into, an adult inmate who had never lived an adult life. And in the eyes of the state, her story was over the moment the cell door closed. She was still alive, still serving her sentence, and still waiting for nothing. For nearly 2 decades, Ruthann Veal's case remained buried in the forgotten files of Iowa's criminal justice system. She was a name that once made headlines, a 14-year-old girl convicted of a brutal murder, but time had moved on. She had become just another inmate serving a life sentence behind thick prison walls. The legal system that had once declared her beyond redemption had left her there to fade into bureaucratic obscurity. But in 2012, everything changed, not because of anything Ruthann did, but because the law itself shifted beneath the weight of new understanding. In June 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a landmark ruling in Miller v. Alabama. The court declared that mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole for juvenile offenders violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. It was a sweeping decision that rippled through the justice system, forcing states across the country to revisit cases where children had been sentenced as if they were adults, cases just like Ruthann Veal's. The ruling didn't guarantee release, but it required courts to consider the age and potential for rehabilitation before issuing life sentences to juveniles. For Ruthann, this legal shift represented the first real moment of possibility since she was arrested in 1993. Her case, which had long been seen as final, was suddenly relevant again. The Iowa legal community took notice. Attorneys and advocates began combing through old files, identifying cases where young offenders had received mandatory life without parole. Ruthann's name surfaced almost immediately. A group of public defenders, working in conjunction with juvenile justice advocates, filed a motion to have Ruthann's sentence reconsidered. Their argument was clear. She was 14 when she committed the crime, and under the new legal standards, the court had failed to adequately consider her age, psychological condition, and potential for growth. The filing detailed the timeline of her early life, from the years of foster care instability to her eventual decision to run away and the events that culminated in the killing of Catherine Haynes. It wasn't an attempt to rewrite history, but to revisit it with fuller context. Court records show that in early 2013, a resentencing hearing was scheduled. Ruthann, now in her mid-30s, was brought back into a courtroom for the first time in years. Reporters who remembered the original trial returned with a sense of curiosity. Who was she now? Was she still that emotionless teenager who had once described a killing with detachment? Or had decades in prison shaped her into someone different? The courtroom atmosphere was vastly different from the original trial. Then she had been a child lost in a sea of adult procedures. This time she was an adult facing a system that had started to question its own past decisions. The judge presiding over the case was new, someone who had not been involved in the original sentencing but who understood the weight of the legal and moral questions now in front of the court. The prosecution stood by the severity of the crime. They reminded the court of the facts. An elderly woman had been stabbed to death in her own home, a credit card stolen, a life ended brutally. They argued that some acts were so heinous that age couldn't excuse them. The state contended that while Ruthann had been young, her actions had been deliberate and violent. The defense, however, presented a broader picture. They introduced testimony from psychologists who had evaluated Ruthann over the years. These professionals described a child who had been emotionally damaged, exhibiting signs of trauma, detachment, and developmental instability even before the crime. They highlighted her behavior in prison, not perfect but not violent either. She had no record of major infractions. She had participated in some educational programs. She had spent time in counseling even if inconsistently. She had aged quietly without ever drawing attention to herself again. Letters were submitted from prison staff who described her as reserved, compliant, and generally respectful. A few noted her distance and emotional flatness, but none described her as threatening or dangerous. One counselor testified that Ruthann had a limited understanding of emotional connections due to her disrupted early years, but that she was not beyond help. Her potential for rehabilitation, the defense argued, had never truly been assessed, not at 14 and not in the years that followed. The judge listened. He weighed the testimony, the original crime, and the legal obligations set forth by the Supreme Court. The ruling came in 2013. Ruthann Veal's sentence would be modified. She was no longer sentenced to life without parole. Instead, she would serve life with the possibility of parole. It wasn't freedom, but it was a door that had previously been locked shut. With this new sentence, Ruthann became eligible to appear before a parole board in the future, a panel that would decide whether she had changed, whether she could safely return to society. It was a chance, not a guarantee. The reaction to the resentencing was mixed. Some in the community felt the decision undermined the gravity of the original crime. Family members of the victim, though largely absent from the public discourse, were reported to have been disappointed but resigned. Legal experts, however, viewed the case as emblematic of a broader shift in juvenile justice. Ruthann's resentencing wasn't about excusing murder. It was about acknowledging that children, even those who commit terrible crimes, might not be the same people decades later. Inside prison, the change was subtle but meaningful. Ruthann's day-to-day life remained the same, but the psychological weight was different. For the first time, her future wasn't sealed in concrete. There was now a pathway, however narrow and uncertain, toward a different outcome. Following the resentencing, Ruthann's legal team began preparing for the eventual parole process. They gathered documentation of her time in prison, coordinated with counselors, and encouraged her to participate in rehabilitation programs. Her engagement was cautious. She had learned not to trust easily, but she began attending more regularly. Reports suggested a slow but notable shift in her behavior. She still rarely spoke much, but she began journaling and reading more extensively. Public interest in her story flared briefly after the resentencing but faded once again. True crime forums mentioned her in passing, and a few documentaries exploring juvenile sentencing reform referenced her case. But she never became a symbol. She was simply one of many, a child once discarded by the system now being reconsidered under new rules. Ruthann herself never spoke to the media. Her silence continued to define her, a reflection perhaps of the emotional damage that shaped her from the beginning. But the law had spoken on her behalf. And what it said was clear. Children are not adults and punishment must reflect that truth. As 2013 came to a close, Ruthann Veal remained behind bars. But something fundamental had changed. For the first time in 20 years, her life had a new trajectory. It was uncertain. It was conditional. But it was a future nonetheless. A future that didn't end with the clang of a cell door, but one that might one day include the sound of it opening. After spending more than 2 decades behind bars, Ruthann Veal was no longer the 14-year-old girl the world had seen in court. She was now a grown woman, marked by years of institutional life. Her face had changed. Her voice had matured. But beneath it all, the story of a child murderer still followed her like a shadow. When the legal system finally offered a sliver of hope, it came not with celebration but with a sense of controlled curiosity. Could someone like Ruthann Veal ever function in the real world? In 2020, Ruthann was selected for a transitional work release program in Iowa, a step cautiously taken by the state, a decision bound by stringent conditions. She was moved to a halfway house facility, a sterile but less restrictive environment compared to prison. It allowed her to hold a job during the day and return to the facility at night. The program wasn't freedom, it was a trial period wrapped in rules. For Ruthann, it was more freedom than she had known since childhood. The work release program had clear conditions: curfews, mandatory employment, zero tolerance for drugs or alcohol, restricted areas and regular check-ins. An ankle monitor tracked her every move. She had to report to supervisors, attend behavioral assessments, and submit to random drug tests. It wasn't leniency, it was oversight. But it was also her first real taste of the outside world in more than 25 years. At first, Ruthann seemed to adapt well. She secured a job at a local warehouse, stocking inventory and performing routine tasks. Coworkers described her as polite, quiet, and punctual. She didn't talk much about her past and most people didn't ask. Within the halfway house, she followed the rules. Her reports were clean. Staff noted her cooperation and willingness to comply. For a brief time, it looked like the system had managed to take a teenage killer and create an adult who could reintegrate into society. But behavior under watch isn't always the same as internal change. Within a few months, subtle signs began to surface. Fragments of a personality still shaped by rebellion, trauma, and mistrust. Ruthann began missing curfew by minutes, then hours. She gave explanations: a late bus, traffic, and emergency at work. Supervisors were wary but initially lenient. Warnings were issued and she promised to improve. But the pattern continued. Then came the violations that couldn't be ignored. Surveillance showed Ruthann entering a local casino, clearly outside the allowed zones. Another report documented her presence at a bar, consuming alcohol, something strictly forbidden under her release terms. When questioned, she didn't deny it. She offered vague responses: "I needed space," or "I wasn't thinking." These weren't the actions of someone unaware, they were deliberate choices. Each violation was reviewed by the Department of Corrections. Each incident was logged and examined. Counselors and parole officers discussed the risk of allowing her to remain on work release. The trust they had placed in her was fading quickly. There was no violent incident, no outburst, no relapse into the kind of aggression that once defined her, but the rule-breaking, though nonviolent, was persistent. And in a system built on order and compliance, even minor defiance carries weight. Some within the department debated whether she was testing boundaries as a way of reclaiming agency, something she never had as a child. Others saw her actions as a sign that prison had failed to rehabilitate her at all. A few believed she was simply overwhelmed by the freedom she hadn't felt in decades. But intention didn't matter. Results did. The message was clear: Ruthann Veal was not ready. In late 2020, after multiple violations and formal warnings, Ruthann's work release was revoked. The halfway house processed her return. There was no public announcement, no media coverage. She was quietly transferred back to the correctional facility she had left only months earlier. A new file was created. Her privileges were suspended. The glimpse of a new life had closed again, this time perhaps for good. Inside prison she didn't protest. She didn't argue with staff. She returned to her old patterns: quiet, reserved, compliant. In interviews conducted later by program officials, she admitted feeling overwhelmed by the pace of the outside world. She spoke about feeling like a visitor, in a place she didn't recognize. Technology, people, language, even clothing, had all changed in her absence. Her mind, she confessed, was still trapped in the 1990s. Records from that period reflect a woman who oscillated between moments of reflection and detachment. She enrolled in another round of behavioral therapy, this time under stricter guidelines. Her counselors noted progress in some sessions but frustration in others. She remained deeply introverted. One entry described her as a woman aging through emotional time zones out of sync with the world around her. The Department of Corrections did not declare her a danger to society, but they also didn't label her rehabilitated. She was placed on a standard parole hold, meaning she would remain incarcerated but could still be reviewed for future parole depending on future behavior and new legal considerations. Her chances, while not gone, were now far slimmer. Public interest in the Ruthann Veal case was almost non-existent by this time. Younger generations didn't recognize her name. The murder of Catherine Haynes had long been replaced in headlines by more recent tragedies. Yet, in the legal and correctional system, Ruthann's case remained a reference point. Her journey highlighted the fragile line between second chances and recidivism, between accountability and compassion. Advocates for prison reform viewed her story with mixed emotions. Some argued that her violations didn't justify complete removal from work release and that more support could have helped her succeed. They cited her age at the time of the original crime and her clean prison record as reasons to continue efforts at rehabilitation. Others took a harder stance, believing that her choices showed she still wasn't prepared to follow rules outside a controlled environment. A prison psychologist later remarked, "She spent her adolescence in survival mode and her adulthood in confinement. Expecting her to suddenly navigate a modern world with flawless judgment was unrealistic. But rules are rules. And in this system, failing to follow them has consequences." By early 2021, Ruthann Veal settled back into prison life. The halfway house job was gone. The outside world, once within arm's reach, faded again into television images and second-hand stories. She rarely spoke of the work release period, though in private writings she noted how strange it felt to breathe unfiltered air, to hear children playing outside, to walk without being escorted. These small freedoms, so ordinary for most, had overwhelmed her. Her story wasn't over, but the chapter on re-entry had ended in failure. A door had opened briefly. She had stepped through. And then she had been pulled back, not by violence, not by tragedy, but by choices that the system couldn't overlook. Ruthann Veal was once a child who committed an adult crime. Then she became an adult who stumbled while being offered a second chance. The law had looked again. It had offered her a path. And she had walked part of it before falling short. As the bars closed behind her once more, she returned not as a cautionary tale, but as a living reminder of how deeply trauma, time, and misdevelopment can shape a human life. She now existed in a place between past and future, still behind bars but no longer invisible. And for those watching, her case posed a hard question. When does a child stop being a child? And can a system built for punishment ever truly prepare someone for freedom? Ruthann Veal's return to prison wasn't just another line in a legal file. It was a turning point, both personally and publicly. For the justice system, it meant a hard question needed to be asked again. What happens when a second chance is handed out and squandered? After her sentence was reduced to life with the possibility of parole in 2013, Ruthann spent the next several years continuing her incarceration at the Iowa Correctional Institution for Women. She was no longer the same volatile teenager who had once stabbed Catherine Haynes to death. She was now in her 30s, quiet, compliant, and by all appearances changed. Correctional staff observed no serious disciplinary issues. Her record during this period reflected someone who had learned how to follow rules, participate in programs, and keep her head down. By the time 2020 arrived, the Iowa Department of Corrections approved her for a transitional program. Ruthann was allowed to enter work release, a supervised arrangement that let inmates live in halfway houses, get jobs, and gradually reintegrate into society under strict conditions. For someone who had been incarcerated since she was 14, it was a massive shift. She was assigned to a facility that served as both a job placement center and transitional housing. There were curfews, drug tests, mandatory check-ins, and GPS tracking through an ankle monitor. Every action was documented, every misstep flagged. Ruthann initially embraced the chance. She got a job working in retail, managed her daily schedule, and followed instructions. From the outside, it looked like the system had worked. A former juvenile offender was now a functioning adult in society. But within a few months, the cracks began to show. Ruthann started testing the limits. She stayed out past curfew, not once but repeatedly. She visited casinos despite being explicitly told not to. She entered bars, even though her agreement with the halfway house strictly prohibited it. When confronted by her supervisors, she didn't deny her actions. There was no confusion, no misunderstanding. These were deliberate decisions. The question wasn't just about her behavior, it was about intent. She wasn't committing new crimes. She wasn't violent. But she was willfully ignoring the structure put in place to help her succeed. And in a system built on the notion of gradual trust, that was enough to bring everything to a halt. Her supervisors logged every infraction. Warnings were issued. Meetings were held. But Ruthann didn't course correct. Within weeks, her violations became a pattern, not a mistake. The Department of Corrections made the decision to revoke her work release. She was returned to the same prison facility she had once left with hope. This moment sparked a renewed wave of scrutiny. Some in the legal community called it a failed experiment in rehabilitation. Critics argued that the very idea of granting parole to juvenile killers was naive. Ruthann had been given a chance, they said, and she blew it. She hadn't changed, not in the ways that mattered. Her behavior wasn't about learning how to function freely, it was about pushing limits just like she had in her youth. Others saw the situation differently. They argued that reintegration for long-term inmates, especially those locked up as children, was incredibly difficult. Ruthann had spent over 2 decades behind bars. She had never held a bank account, never rented an apartment, never navigated adult life outside of institutional walls. Her idea of freedom was theoretical. Once faced with actual autonomy, she faltered, not because she was dangerous but because she was unprepared. Social workers and criminal justice reform advocates pointed out that her infractions were rooted in immaturity and adjustment struggles, not malice. They emphasized that her behavior didn't involve drugs, violence, or reoffending. It reflected poor judgment, yes, but also underscored how little she understood the world she had been dropped into. Critics of the system asked whether more comprehensive support, rather than punishment, might have produced a different outcome. Yet the law doesn't operate on hypotheticals. And the parole board, already under pressure from media attention and public discourse, saw in Ruthann's choices a risk that couldn't be ignored. She had proven unable, or unwilling, to follow conditions that were far less restrictive than prison. That reality weighed heavily. As news of her return to custody spread, talk shows, news articles, and legal opinion pieces reignited the debate about second chances for juvenile offenders. The 2012 Supreme Court ruling in Miller v. Alabama had set off a national reconsideration of what justice should look like for kids who kill. Many of those kids had since been released or resentenced. But Ruthann's case became a cautionary tale, a test case that didn't go as planned. Supporters feared that her failure would become an excuse to halt progress. That politicians and prosecutors would point to her as evidence that rehabilitation is a myth. That parole boards, once cautiously optimistic, would turn skeptical again. The cost of one mistake was being measured in headlines, legislation, and public trust. Meanwhile, inside prison, Ruthann reportedly returned to the same rhythm she had lived for most of her life. She wasn't placed in solitary or punished beyond the revocation of her work release, but the opportunity she had lost was deeply felt. According to correctional staff reports, she expressed disappointment in herself. She acknowledged her actions but also insisted that she hadn't realized how unready she was to live outside. Her reintegration, she claimed, was rushed. Whether that was an excuse or a confession of truth remained up for interpretation. For her victim's family, none of this softened the blow. Catherine Haynes' relatives saw Ruthann's failure as confirmation that justice had taken too long to begin with. To them, the fact that she was ever considered for release was an insult to Catherine's memory. Her return to prison didn't provoke sympathy, it sparked relief. For others, especially those who study criminal justice reform, the situation was more complex. Ruthann wasn't unique in her challenges. Many former juvenile lifers released across the country had stumbled during reintegration. A few had reoffended. Others had relapsed into addiction. The success rate wasn't perfect, but it wasn't hopeless either. The question remained, what is the price of a second chance and who should pay it when things go wrong? In Iowa, Ruthann's case quietly faded from public view after the media storm settled. She wasn't given another shot at work release. Her eligibility for parole remained technically intact, but her next review was postponed indefinitely. In bureaucratic terms, her status was on hold. In real terms, she was back where she had started, serving time, watched closely, and with little public sympathy left. The arc of her story posed uncomfortable truths. It revealed how difficult it is to measure rehabilitation. It showed that time served doesn't always equate to lessons learned. And it forced the public to ask a brutal question. If someone fails after being given a second chance, does that failure justify denying second chances to everyone else? In that silence, the one that followed the revoked parole, the closed case file, the unanswered questions, Ruthann remained. Not a monster. Not a martyr. Just a woman who had once been a child in a courtroom, given another chance and now, left to live with what she had done with it. Ruthann Veal remains in the custody of the Iowa Department of Corrections, her days confined to the walls that have long defined her adult life. Unlike the early years of her case, When her name was splashed across headlines and discussed in legal journals, Ruthann now exists quietly within the system. For the outside world, she is no longer a topic of conversation, no longer a symbol, no longer a controversy. She is a prisoner whose name rarely surfaces, except in routine parole board updates or internal legal documentation. The passing years have not softened the sharp edges of her case, but they have dulled public memory. The media has long moved on to newer stories, newer controversies. True crime shows may reference her occasionally, but rarely with depth. In the age of streaming documentaries and social media outrage, Ruthann's story feels like a remnant of a different era. Yet her presence within the system continues, unchanged, uncelebrated, and unresolved. Inside prison, Ruthann has reportedly kept a low profile. Guards and officials describe her as compliant, though emotionally detached. She participates in required programs, avoids confrontation, and rarely speaks about the crime that changed her life at age 14. For those unfamiliar with her backstory, she might appear like any other inmate serving time for a long-ago offense. But beneath that surface lies the weight of a deeply complex narrative, one that intertwines trauma, justice, failure, and the enduring consequences of choices made in childhood. She entered prison in the mid-1990s, when Bill Clinton was president and the internet was still a novelty. Over the decades, the world outside has changed beyond recognition. Cell phones, streaming video, social media, and digital communication, all things she never truly lived with, now define the outside world. Reintegration for someone like Ruthann would not only require emotional and social adaptation but also an entirely new technological education. Prison, for all its discipline, offers little preparation for re-entering a society that evolves daily. Her story remains a point of reference in criminal justice debates. Academics occasionally cite her case in papers about juvenile sentencing. Lawyers bring her name up when arguing for or against the parole of juvenile lifers. Yet even in those discussions, Ruthann is often reduced to a case file, a legal precedent, not a human being. Her actual voice, her own reflections remain largely unheard. She has never written a memoir, never spoken publicly since her early years in prison, and has not participated in media interviews. Whether by personal choice or institutional restriction, Ruthann Veal has become invisible. And perhaps that is the most haunting part of her legacy. She has become the forgotten name in a conversation she once helped ignite. The 2012 Supreme Court decision in Miller v. Alabama sparked a wave of resentencing hearings across the country. Ruthann was one of many whose cases were reviewed, thanks to the court's ruling that mandatory life without parole for juveniles was unconstitutional. But unlike some others who were granted freedom and used it to rebuild their lives, Ruthann's return to prison following parole violations cast a long shadow. It created a new line of division in public discourse, between those who believe some people are beyond rehabilitation and those who argue the system itself failed to support her reintegration. It is easy to say that she had a second chance and wasted it. It is harder to admit that we gave her a second chance without truly preparing her for it. For much of her life, Ruthann had been under some form of state control. From foster care to juvenile detention to adult prison, she never truly experienced the autonomy that most people take for granted. Rules were set for her, boundaries imposed, routines mandated. And when she was finally given a version of freedom, through work release and halfway housing, she responded not with responsibility, but with impulsivity. She broke curfew, entered casinos, visited places that were clearly off-limits. These were not violent crimes, but they were violations. And they revealed the gap between institutional obedience and genuine behavioral change. Her fall from conditional freedom back into incarceration wasn't dramatic. There were no high-speed chases, no violent acts, no media spectacle. Just a quiet return to the cell. The same cell she had once hoped would be her past. Ruthann's story complicates easy narratives. She doesn't fit neatly into the role of victim or villain. She is both a product of her environment and an agent of her own choices. The brutality of her crime cannot be erased. A woman named Catherine Haynes was murdered, and that fact sits at the center of everything. But so too does the reality that Ruthann was 14, unstable, traumatized, and effectively alone when she committed that act. The adult justice system tried her as a woman. Society labeled her a monster. And over the years, as her face aged and her notoriety faded, she simply became another forgotten prisoner. No rehabilitation system can guarantee success. Not every second chance will be used wisely. But the story of Ruthann Veal shows what happens when a society responds to childhood violence with only confinement. When punishment is swift but healing is delayed. When a child is held accountable for adult decisions, but never offered the emotional tools to grow into the adult society expects her to become. In her current state, Ruthann's life is largely routine. Wake up. Roll call. Meals. Assign work duty. Recreation within the yard. Lights out. The world moves outside her walls, but inside, the rhythm rarely changes. Some inmates mark time by calendar dates. Others stop counting altogether. Ruthann, by most accounts, belongs to the latter. Her life is not lived in anticipation but in maintenance, keeping things steady, avoiding trouble, staying invisible. And still, her case lingers in the files of public defenders, the memories of parole officers, and the minds of those who study the failures of the juvenile justice system. For them, Ruthann's case is not just a tragedy, it's a cautionary tale. A reminder of how early neglect, combined with institutional rigidity, can shape a life permanently. If there's one question her story leaves us with, it's this. What do we owe a child once we have already failed them? That question isn't about leniency. It's about responsibility. Society often claims to protect its children. But Ruthann's early life, marked by foster care instability, emotional trauma, and school disengagement, shows just how easily a child can slip through every safety net. By the time she committed murder, Ruthann had already been abandoned by nearly every adult structure meant to support her. Now, decades later, she remains in a system that is content to keep her there. She is no longer seen as a risk, nor as a rehabilitative priority. She exists quietly behind bars. Occasionally, advocates for criminal justice reform still bring up her case. Some believe she should be re-evaluated for parole. Others argue her brief time outside already proved she isn't ready. The debate is ongoing but increasingly quiet. The legal updates become shorter, the hearings more procedural. The passion that once surrounded her name has cooled into bureaucracy. And so, Ruthann Veal becomes not just a case study but a symbol. Not of hope, not of danger, but of abandonment. Her life story is a ledger of missed interventions, a map of lost opportunities, and a reflection of how justice, when stripped of humanity, often fails everyone involved. Her name may not trend. It may not be searched or spoken about. But it remains etched into the system. A system that once called her irredeemable, then called her rehabilitated, then put her back behind bars. And there she remains.